I'm a person who enjoys cooking, but it sure is a lot easier picking up the phone, calling your local Indian restaurant and placing an order for curry, rice and naans than it is making it yourself. But I wanted to cook some curries, so I went ahead and made a beef curry. I don't know exactly what type of a curry it is, but I find you can't really go too wrong as long as you've got the right ingredients and roughly the right proportions of spices and flavours. So beef curry, butter chicken, and naan. And for anyone unfortunate enough to never have heard of or eaten naan before, it's an Indian flatbread that is served with curries and is absolutely delicious. So the beef curry is up first, and for that I've chopped up 3 large brown onions and am sautéing them in some olive oil. I use a large heavy-bottomed cast iron pot that has a lid and can go in the oven because I want to slow cook the beef so that it's nice and tender by the time it's ready. Cook the onions on a medium heat on the stove until they're starting to go translucent and soft. While that's going, peel and crush your garlic. This is one of the heads that I recently picked out of the garden. And then peel and finely grate your ginger. As you can see, around 8-ish cloves of garlic and a metric chunk of ginger. Next thing to do is gather the spices, and for this I like to use 1 cinnamon stick, around 3 teaspoons of garam masala, 2 teaspoons of coriander powder, 2 teaspoons of cumin powder, 3 teaspoons of turmeric, 2 bay leaves, and 3 teaspoons of paprika, and around a teaspoon of salt. You can substitute some or all of the paprika for chili powder if you want a more fiery curry, but this one is meant to be a bit more mild so that the kids can cope with it. Now that the onion has started to soften a bit and start to brown, add in your ginger and garlic, and then mix that through with the onion and give it a little bit of time to cook. Just give that a gentle stir and mix it around for a minute or two. The next step is my favourite step, which is adding in all of the spices and mixing that through. As soon as the spices get mixed through the onion, garlic, ginger and oil and start to heat up, the spices start to release their rich earthy aromas and it completely fills the room with an amazing scent. Keep mixing everything around until all of the spice powders have been well combined and you don't have any dry sections or lumps. And try not to let it catch at the bottom. If it's starting to catch too much, take it off the heat and wait until you've added some liquid to it. But this is on a medium heat and it just needs an occasional stir. While that's heating through, you can start preparing the beef. The meat I used for this is gravy beef, and I just like to cut off any of the heavier bits of fat that aren't going to render down really well. Cut it into bite-sized chunks. Just try and think of whenever you've had Indian food, roughly how big the pieces are, and try to go something along those lines. A little bigger, obviously, because they'll shrink down as they cook. Make sure that you have a sharp knife and that you hone the blade before you do this, because cutting through the fat is so much easier when you have a very sharp knife. Keep breaking down the meat until it's all done. You can see that there are sort of sections of the meat that are separated by fat. I just find it easiest to separate out each of the sections of meat, cut off the fat around the outer edges of it, and then break it down into a few individual bite-sized pieces. And don't get too carried away while you're preparing the meat and forget about the onion and the spices. You don't want that to burn. Transfer the meat into the pot with the spices, onion, garlic and ginger and mix everything around until all the meat is coated. You can leave the meat flat on the bottom for a little while to start to brown the outer edges a bit, but The main point is here to just make sure everything's mixed through. You're not necessarily looking to sear or brown the meat. It's going to cook long and slow anyway. This is still just on a medium heat on the stove top. You can use fresh tomatoes in this curry if you want to, and if you have a lot of them, I'd say go for it, but it's a lot cheaper and easier to buy a couple of cans of crushed tomatoes and use that. Continue stirring the beef around a little bit. You can see not every side of every piece is brown or even close to it, but as long as everything is sort of mixed together and it's well coated, that's fine. Throw in your 2 cans of diced tomatoes, and it's not shown here, but rinse the cans out and keep the tomatoey water. Essentially add 1 full can of water to this as well. Mix everything together and bring it to a simmer, and once it's all combined and simmering, put the lid on it and transfer it to the oven. This curry cooked for 5 hours in the oven at 120 degrees or around 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Check the curry every hour or so and take it out and give it a stir, and if it looks like it needs more liquid, add water. Now to start making the butter chicken. Take chicken breasts and cut them into, again, bite-sized pieces. Think of when you go to an Indian restaurant and you have butter chicken. How big are the pieces of chicken that you get in there? Try to make them roughly that size. Cut off any fat, sinew, any other stuff you don't want in your curry, and keep going till it's done. And in the next bit, I did one of those things where you press the record button to stop recording and realize that you've started recording. So I missed the bit where I cut up the garlic and the ginger and mix in paprika and some salt and mix that through the pieces of chicken that I just cut up. I had it all prepped and I must have stuffed something up. Anyway, this is the end result. The chicken and the garlic and the paprika and the ginger are all mixed through, and the chicken is ready to start frying off. I needed both hands here and I couldn't hold the camera or position the tripod in a way that you can see what's going on. But you're basically frying off the chicken in a little bit of oil and setting it aside for later. You then roughly chop 3 onions, and these are ones that I picked from my garden, and they seem to be good quite a long way up the stem, so I just kept some of that and used it, and they turned out very nicely. Cook the onion on the stove on a medium heat in the same pan or pot that you did the chicken in. I used a large stock pot in this case because I was cooking a pretty big quantity of it. Stir that all through and let it simmer. I didn't show it here, but also throw some butter in with the onions, and that'll help soften it all up and give it a nice buttery flavour. While the onion is simmering, peel and crush some more garlic, around 6 to 8 cloves. Add the crushed garlic to the now softening onions and butter and mix that all through. I got a bit flustered with the number of things cooking at once and trying to film it all at the same time, and I did end up missing a few sections. But this recipe is heavily based on the Get Curried recipe for butter chicken. I'll provide a link in the description, and I strongly encourage you to check that out. But this is my rough interpretation of that, with various substitutions based on what I had at hand and what I think tastes good. The original recipe calls for fresh tomatoes, but I used 2 cans of diced tomatoes, and I also added a jar of passata as well. Not shown is the addition of cashew nuts, malt vinegar, sugar, salt, and kasuri methi, or fenugreek leaves, all of which you blend up with a stick blender after it's cooked down for a while and softened, and then you transfer that to another pot and put the contents through a sieve to try to get out any of the lumpier things like unblended cashew nuts, tomato seeds, tomato skins, anything of that nature. Then what you're left with is a very smooth consistency for the butter chicken gravy. It doesn't look like it when it's been sped up like this, but it is actually quite a time-consuming and laborious process. I don't really do anything with the stuff that's been strained out, other than put it in with the scraps to go out to the chickens. Feeding butter chicken scraps to the chickens, it's the circle of life. Now that that's all strained, scrape off the outside of the sieve to get the remaining sauce off. Put all the chicken pieces back into the pot, transfer the gravy back in and mix everything around and let that heat on a medium heat until everything is bubbling and hot. You want to make sure that the chicken is cooked all the way through. Frying it off before cooks the outside of it, but the centers might not be completely cooked. So covering it in the sauce and bringing it back up to heat is crucial to make sure that everything is properly cooked. Once the butter chicken is heating up, I start rolling out the naans and getting them ready. But it's about 2 hours before this that I've already made the dough, so we'll flash back here to the process of making the dough. I had to make a couple of on-the-fly adjustments. I didn't have quite enough plain yogurt, so I substituted some sour cream and thickened cream, and it seemed to work quite well. It's basically plain flour, yeast, plain yogurt, water, a little bit of sugar to activate the yeast, and some salt, which I just knead in a stand mixer for around 10 minutes or until the dough becomes soft and pliable. Transfer it to an oiled bowl and either cover it with a wet tea towel, or if you have a lid, just cover it with that. Put a little bit of olive oil on the outside of the dough ball as well, and that'll help it stretch a bit. I filmed a time lapse of it and you can see the dough roughly doubling in size over a 2-hour period. Once your dough is risen, transfer it onto a floured surface and divide it equally into the right number of portions. In this case, I'm making 12 naan. When you've divided up each of your portions, then roll each ball out into a roughly 30 centimeter by 15 centimeter flat bread thing. I like to cook the naan over coals. I don't have a tandoor, but I've got the next best thing, which is a Kamado Joe with some reasonably mellow coals going underneath. You don't want them too hot. I've had it before where it's been a little bit violent and it's been difficult to get the naans to cook without burning. This was just about the right temperature, and you'll see that the naans start to really bubble up soon. The one right in the center definitely had the right position. I think I got a bit better at positioning them as they went along, but the middle one is definitely doing well. It's an interesting process watching the naans bubble up like this. This probably doesn't cook quite the same way as a tandoor would, because the naan is being heated directly from underneath, but it's a pretty close approximation and works quite well. You can see that the dough is very soft and pliable, and it remains that way throughout the cooking process. Even though the outside is nice and toasted, more on the middle one. The other one needs a bit longer on that side, but it doesn't dry out at all. It still seems to be quite moist, and I think that's because of the yogurt content in there. You can see occasional puffs of steam coming out from the bubbles inside the naan. I just try to keep checking them, making sure that they're not burning too badly, and repositioning them so that all parts of them get a nice toasty sort of brown color. While they're still hot, I like to take some salted butter and smear that on the outside of it. I know that ghee is traditionally used, but I like salted butter and it seems to work well, and I usually have that readily available. there were a few video shots that I really wanted to get and I completely forgot to do. I think I was just a bit flustered and wanted to sit down after spending most of the day cooking. I wanted to get some of the naan being torn open and also one of the plates of curry being dished up to look nice, but I didn't manage to get there, so you get a bit of a flyover of the table and that's about it at the end, but it was a really tasty meal and really enjoyable having all of the family over and seeing some of the nieces and nephews come back for third and fourth helpings of some of the curries, so pretty successful. This is the beef curry and then the butter chicken. They don't look all that different there, but they definitely taste different and they were a big hit, as were the naans. So very happy with how it turned out, but it was a lot of work.